So another interesting topic that I've seen you speak on, and you mentioned it briefly, and I want to get more into it, is the concept of cognitive biases behind security decision making. So, what are some of the logical issues that people make in security strategy? They're making incorrectly, and what are you prescribing as an alternative?
Yeah, so I would say, gosh, I could talk about this probably for the whole hour to
Okay.
go through them all. I think, one I've been trying to highlight a lot recently, because I've definitely gotten pushback on things like the black hat talk, where people are kind of set in their ways,
Mm,
which is status quo bias. So it's basically the way that we've always done it is the better way, just because it's the way we've always done
yeah,
it.
it worked fine. Yeah,
Right. Sometimes there is evidence for that, but a lot of times there's not.
yeah.
So what's interesting is, empirically speaking, that deviating from the status quo can actually feel like some sort of loss to people. It feels like they're, losing something.
Hmm.
And I think that's very true for security from what I've seen. If you've created some sort of policy, you've implemented a tool, it can almost feel like a failure when you move away from it. Like maybe my strategy wasn't good enough or something. And it definitely creates a lot of fear, even if it's the best course of action. So I think status quo bias definitely pervades a lot. Um, Generally speaking, I think humans are bad at kind of evaluating options neutrally and quote unquote rationally.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we're more likely to gravitate towards what we already know, because that helps it be a little more comfortable. And in general, there's the concept of choice fatigue, where if we have too many choices, it's kind of like those really extensive menus you sometimes see at diners. Like, I'm just like, oh my God, I have no idea what I
Yeah.
could possibly get.
I don't want anything. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just easier to go with what we already know.
Hmm.
I think there are a few ways to counter it. One, I think, is talking about value proposition is really important, but removing labels. So one could present a shift to like microservices or APIs as having the pros of like easier diagnostics. You're removing numerous vulnerability classes, removing the ability for attackers to like use automated attack tools sometimes, tangible best practices, and then things like standardization's benefits. Then monoliths, in contrast, maybe have a pro like, okay, it's a single resource, maybe it's easier to track. There's more direct control that the security team can have. But my guess is without labels attached, most security teams will be like, this first one sounds a lot more interesting, even though if they hear the
Mm,
words microservices and API, they panic because they're like, oh my God, I don't really know what that means.
okay.
So I think it's important to kind of look at the pros, cons, and try to remove, I guess, the words that can cause a little trepidation among the team. But one thing that I've seen in some behavioral economics research is the idea of the reversal test, as well as the double reversal test,
Okay.
which is basically the idea that it's almost like taking it to its logical extreme. So
Hmm.
let's say the security team currently disallows containers or something like that. And then someone proposes like, hey, developers should maybe use containers because it allows for greater standardization. You can do things like killing resources. It has the benefits of the immutable infrastructure I outlined earlier. So it's just easier to catch bugs and implement changes and respond to incidents more quickly. But if the security team pushes back, and this is definitely something I've heard them do, the question to ask is then, would less standardization be better? If the argument is, pro standardization, then you ask them kind of the reverse of that is like, okay, if you're against more standardization, then clearly you think maybe that we should have less standardization.
Right.
But they're probably going to argue that less standardization isn't better. So then you have to really needle them on like, okay, so why are we suddenly in this perfect sweet spot of standardization, right? Like
Yeah.
something probably isn't right. And the double reversal test is just basically taking this even further, which can be kind of fun though.
Yeah.
Obviously you can sound a bit like, I'm sure to a certain extent, to basically set up the scenario like change is inevitable, and you just have to go forward. And the idea is that would you intervene to go back to how things are today? So for example, like PCI, suddenly for compliance, you're required to move everything to a public cloud. Obviously that's going to be a headache for a lot of organizations, but let's say they do it over a few years, the security team has figured it out. But then a few years later, the PCI removes that requirement to be able to meet compliance. So then the question is, should the organization migrate all of their stuff from the public cloud back to where it is today? My guess is most of the time the security team will be like, no, that doesn't make sense. In which case it's probably then status quo bias if they're resisting moving to it in the first place.